Our first speaker this morning is Professor Ram Mahalingham from the University of Michigan. He's an associate professor of psychology and of education and has done some really interesting and important work on the concept of intersectionality, the ways in which various aspects of our self-identity are formed in relationship with others, and the various roles that we play and how ourselves change as they inhabit these different roles. In many ways, Ram spoke here and gave a wonderful lecture last year and a wonderful workshop. And in many ways, the work that he's doing reminds me of some of the classical Confucian teachings. That's one term we haven't been talking about very much here is Confucianism, but was very much in my mind yesterday, having attended the memorial service for one of the really outstanding kind of radical Confucian thinkers, Professor Henry Rosemont. He was very interested in the ways in which ourselves are not really independent, isolated units, and that we change and use different aspects of ourselves depending on the social context, the kind of second-person relationships that we form. Anyway, enough about that. Please, without any further delay, please join me in welcoming Professor Ram Mahalingham.
Good morning. Thank you for having me here. I'm sorry I couldn't join most of the conference because it was a last-minute invitation and I was hosting a social justice and human rights conference in Michigan. My conference just ends Saturday morning, so I have to negotiate a lot of things to come here. So I'm glad to see you all here. What I want to do is to provide some ways how I use intersectionality in my research and in my teaching. So it may be useful for you to use in your work, hopefully. So just I'm come through the broader sense of the word critical mindfulness, that tradition. Within this, we have decolonizing contemplative studies. I share a lot of epistemological and philosophical kinship with these people. So then I want to give an introduction to what intersectionality is, how it is studied. Then the tools you can use, pedagogical tools, a board game we developed, and an intersectionality tree, and also other two resources you could use from University of Michigan to use this in your work. Then I'm also going to talk about the connection to intersectionality in my own work on dignity. I study janitors in 3 different countries. So I'm going to talk about dignity and invisibility, how intersectionality is also helpful for us to think about invisibility within workplace. So I'm primarily studying workplace discrimination. That's my work right now. People like Ron Purser talks about, mindfulness, and Kakali Bhattacharya, she wrote about, and Beth Verila, these people write about decolonizing contemplative studies. I have a lot of kinship with them, but we have come from different perspectives. So when we think about mindfulness, one of the questions is, what is it? What is it for? So today I live in the moment, unless the moment becomes unpleasant, in which case I'll take a nap. So basically when there is unpleasantness, so being in the moment is what moment is the question. Is it a pleasant moment or unpleasant moment? Uncomfortable moments. I am one of the few male faculty members in women's studies department. So sometimes it'll be very interesting to sit in a room full of women and talk about masculinity and crisis in masculinity, and I was the only male sitting in the room. So there is a very unpleasant, uncomfortable, but I have to sit with the uncomfortable to really understand what the issues are. So I have to go through that. So mindfulness, it's another big term. Ron Purser has been writing about a lot about this. He has a new book, handbook on corporate mindfulness. So I'm very close in ties with Thich Nhat Hanh's work on interbeing, so keeping consciousness alive to the present reality. So when you are aware, you are not really turning inward, but you're also engaged awareness. Not a dispassionate detachment, but it's also engaged living. Two people's life, two of my heroes who shaped my life. I used to be a civil engineer before I became a child psychologist, and I'm here now. Dr. Ambedkar, who is Dalit, came to Columbia, got his PhD. He was John Dewey's student. Came back to India. He wrote our constitution. He fought against untouchability. He wrote a book, Annihilation of Caste. He was also in touch with W. Du Bois, so very interesting man. He, 3 months before his death, he converted to Buddhism. About 300,000 people converted the same day. That the largest Buddhist conversion in the world happened. They are all Dalits, untouchables. So unfortunately, he died after that. So 3 months after that. So now there is a lot of interest on him and Navayana Buddhism, where he talked about Buddhism for social transformation. So I directly come from the lineage in the way how I think about it, because I studied Dalit identity in India. That was my work. My dissertation was on that. So liberty, equality, and fraternity. So he really uses certain ways of the Western democracy and Deweyan idea, brought it back to talk about transforming Indian society. Gandhi also came to the West, but he went back to Indian roots. So they both are the two iconic figures of Indian political scape. And he really embraced more a Western idea of democracy, equality, whereas Gandhi went into Indian roots to look at how to think about equality. So both are very different perspectives. I'm much more in line with him because I used to be active in social justice movement in India. The other person whose work very important to me is Bell Hooks. As a teacher, she's also a Buddhist. So she talks about how to think about diversity and idea of privilege and being the dominator, how we have to overcome that. As an African American scholar, she has a certain position about this situation, about the situated nature of our lives in relation to power and privilege, right? So she really think about how being different also creates fear and how to encounter with this and being uncomfortable with that. So she's very prolific about this, Teaching for Transformation, which yesterday also mentioned. It's a very important book in many ways. So Christopher Quinn defined this term engaged Buddhism, which is one of the ways I closely relate to my work. So how to think about greed, and we have hate, greed, and delusion, how to transform it to love, generosity, and wisdom. And this is sort of a goal in terms of transformational. As a teacher, this is something I do. I also bring my work from the field too. So the epistemological framework for my teaching and my work in intersectionality before I moved to intersectionality is the decolonizing the mind. Tiango's famous book came in 1986. It was very influential. It was translated in almost all Indian languages. And unfortunately, people don't talk about his work now. So it's a very important work. So he really talk about hegemony, how we internalize certain values. How the internalization of prejudice, role of language when you write in English versus in Tamil, and how you spoke about these things. So he really talked about decolonizing as a way of internalizing dominant values. So I use it to really teach my gender psychology course and how much we internalize gender values and how as a male and heteronormative assumptions we make. So the question is how to break the essentialist notions of identity, which is my basic work. There are three barriers. One is power. So I studied essentialism and power in India. People who are in the dominant caste, they're more likely to be essentialist. For example, I gave a story. This is a Brahmin woman, and this is a Dalit woman. Their mothers gave birth. By mistake, the nurse switched their babies at birth. When they grow up, what will be their caste identity in different households? Brahmins believe that whoever is the birth mother, that will be the caste identity. Whereas Dalits believed that that's really whoever is raised the child will be the identity of the child, caste identity. So how these essentialist notions are also tied to power and privilege. For example, if I do a study on men and women, gender differences, which is a major topic in psychology and learning, if I say women are not good at math, more likely men are likely to endorse the statement more than women, which is typically the case. I have a lot of data on that. So lack of privilege awareness also, we are tied to essentialist notions of identity. So essentialism is one of the intervention, if you look at any critical feminist theory, anti-essentialism is one of the major interventions they do. How to think about identity as socially constructed, situated, historicized, all those things. Then how to change intergroup perceptions. Sort of then the idea of invisibility of suffering, people who are different from us, so we don't pay attention to that. So this is sort of these are my core curricular goals when I teach this, more or less, all the courses when I teach mindfulness or I teach sports and gender psychology. So we'll come back to these 4 kind of questions. So essentialism has been defined in different ways, how people believe categories are fixed, they're biologically transmitted. So essentialism is a very huge topic, philosophically, and psychologists study differently. So essentialist thinking to intersectional awareness, that's sort of a goal, where you think of male and females as sort of fixed. These are the terms, and how to help students to move from essentialist notions of gender towards an intersectional understanding of gender as situated, historically conditioned, culturally conditioned, class, all locations come. So to really move this, help students move from essentialist notions of identity to intersectional awareness, I just want to explain what intersectional awareness is. So this is a very core of my way of thinking about mindfulness, or my work in. It's understanding our identities are fluid, situational, and they are located in different axes of privilege and marginality. So Kimberly Crenshaw, who is a legal scholar who coined this term, intersectionality, but it is taken on in a major topic in critical feminist theory. So to be more concrete, intersectionality is about the different identities we have: gender, sex, sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, social class, religion, spirituality, faith, disability, body size, type, age. So it's also about privilege. It's one when you think something is not a problem because it's not a problem to us personally. And it's also different axes. You can think of racism, sexism, along different dimensions. We look at intersectional awareness. So it's also, we can think of different ways of conceptualizing it as Venn diagram, where different identities overlap. So the meanings, and they simultaneously we feel this. So when I tell students, first time when I was teaching my my women's studies course, gender psychology, I want to be a cool professor. So I went on my t-shirt and my jeans. Those days there was no overhead projector. I had to wheel in my overhead projector. People who are older people might know those days. So when you had to wheel in, so the students thought they were expecting a woman faculty to come and teach. They thought I was the Asian tech guy, which is true. I'm also an engineer. I'm an Asian tech guy, which is true. But so I was just, after that, first class, I always dress up now. So make sure that I'm clear, I'm the teacher. So I really talk about intersectionality as how different identities simultaneously affect who I was, because women's studies, typically 99% of the faculty are women. They are very right about their thinking why a guy is standing here. So these different ways, how they simultaneously affect what are the unique experiences, combination of these identities, and social locations where we are. So the key word is simultaneity, experience, and the idea of identity and social location. So it's also triangulation of our social location, social positioning. Positionality is important. Almost every speaker yesterday talked about positionality. Some feminist journals, as a researcher, you have to talk about your own positionality. You have to write who you are, why you do this work, and what kind of person you are. The positionality is about the social location, social positioning, and vis-a-vis historically how they are situated. It's multidimensional, it's very dynamic, and it also helps us to really think about who we are. So it's really a dynamic process. It's not fixed in a way we think about it. So why is intersectionality important? So it gives three things for us. Look at diversity within a category, right? Take Asian Americans or Indian Americans. We have a whole range of Indians, but people typically think of us either as yoga teachers or doctors and engineers. And if you notice, what people don't pay attention, 90% of the motels are owned by Indians. If you drive from New York to Florida, 90% of the motels will be owned by Indians. And almost 85% of the New York cab drivers are South Asians. It's from Pakistan or India, so I can talk to them exactly when I get into the car. So there are diversity between and within groups and categories that are associated with power and social privilege. And there are shared privileges and shared oppression. How to think about so that students not think of these identities in binaries as male, female, white, black, but they are also shared privileges, shared oppressions. And this is the most difficult part to communicate to students in my teaching over the years, using intersectionality as a central focus of my teaching. So what does intersectionality do with mindfulness? That's the question. So you are all interested in mindfulness. So it's also about radical possibilities. The way we see this, me and my students think about is, it's a radical, it's affecting a fundamental nature of something, far-reaching. It's also relating and change of something, root of something that's particularly we want to change. So intersectionality provides some radical possibilities. So I think one of the exercises we do is, the Four Noble Truths. Students know about this. We teach them. There is suffering. Suffering has an origin. Suffering can cease. There is a path out of suffering. Then we provide an intersectional perspective where we actually ask them to think through the question more carefully. Who is suffering? Why are they suffering? How am I contributing to their suffering? How are we all suffering? What do I suffer when they do not? Why do they suffer when I do not? How can I help them not to suffer? Right? So it's really, the exercise helps them to really contextualize this sort of a broad, abstract notions of suffering to really much more contextualize an intersectional way of thinking about it. It helps students to orient towards the question. It opens up a lot of possibilities for conversation. Then we also use another exercise, which is, he's a Japanese psychotherapist. It's called Nikon therapy in Japan, where you write a journal. What I have received from, what I have given to, what troubles and difficulties have I caused. So these provide a self-reflection manual. Basically, what happens is really helps them to really think about your suffering in a larger context, how it is related to other people. So are you the source of suffering? Who is causing it? So it really helps students to really think about their question beyond just their personal suffering. So in a way, it really helps them to really think about this. So I have a lecture on Nikon. So you look at Yoshimoto Ishin's work, so a lot of things are available online too. It's a 20 to 30 minutes daily reflection. It's still practiced in many parts of Japan. Marital Therapy is another one where you really look at the changing nature of your emotions. And this is one of my favorite. I also introduce Marital Therapy students to really think about this question. So the intersectionality, one of the challenges in intersectionality is how to think about intersectionality. So there is a question when you think of intersectionality, who is the most oppressed? Is this the African-American woman who is single mother, who is also handicapped, who is HIV positive, will be the most oppressed person? In a way, if you think about oppression that way, what we call the oppression Olympics, that really helps people really think about oppression. Who is the most oppressed? Then that become a privileged epistemic position. So we really help students think through this question. The question is, we are not going through oppression Olympics now. Instead, we are looking at the situated nature of intersectionality, where you be reflective about your own positioning, what Yuval Davis calls rooting. You root yourself in this position, but yet you can understand the other person. The idea of shifting. So she talks about situated intersectionality as the process by which you can engage what you call the traversal dialogue, the dialogue with the other, where you also understand your own identity, you don't give up. Bell Hooks also talks about it. So rooting and shifting, so we really provide some tools for students to think about intersectionality as a dynamic process where you engage with the question of understanding the other, yet understand your own privileges, how you can use it to understand, go through this point. Of course, it's very abstract, so when you try to teach it, students get it, sometimes don't get it. So one of my former students, she was very, very frustrated with this. In the discussion sections, we said, okay, we should do something about it. So, being an American entrepreneurial person, she came up with a board game. The board game is called The American Dream. So where you play, all the players start here. When you reach the end, there's a white picket fence. That's the American dream. You reach the house, you have a white picket fence. So Jennifer M. is my former student. She developed this board game. She's selling it. It's also called kimchipower@gmail.com. She's a Korean American. So people who have eaten Korean food will know kimchi is central to their food cuisine. It's very central to them. Everything starts with kimchi for them. Kimchipower@gmail.com. You can order it. So Jennifer has been developed this board game. Now she's doing a lot of diversity training with this board game. So let me walk you through how the board game is. It may be useful to you. So usually you have 3 or 5 students. So it takes between 2 to 3 hours for you to play the game and do the debriefing. Each student will get a character card. The character card will have a description of different identities they have. Then they have to write a narrative about the identity. They have to write who they are based on this character card. Then they have to share this. They will wear the name tag with the person name they have. They will talk about it. Then the game starts. Before that, it takes this warming up. They have to really do this. So this is the character card looks like. Albert, who is male, white, citizenship, USA, sexual orientation, heterosexual, Protestant, upper middle class, language, speaks English. So we give the very bare bone, multiple intersections, identities, so that they can write a story. So when I told them that they have to write a story, usually it takes a lot of time for them to write it, or sometimes they don't engage it whenever I ask them to write a story because they really don't take it seriously. Being used to be a filmmaker before, I come up with a plan. This is the character you're going to audition for my movie. Imagine you're going to audition for my film. This is the character you're going to play. Then Albert becomes more interesting. He's heterosexual. He's also very conflicted about his identity. They write a very beautiful narrative about he's a cab driver, but he still has a PhD in biochemistry. He's trying to finish it. All kind of fascinating stories. So once you become auditioning, so that becomes a tool for them to engage with the narrative. So then we really created now the handouts really, we actually ask them to really explicitly pitch a story. You're going to play the role, right? So Farina, female, Asian, she's heteroflexible. Then they don't know what heteroflexible is. Somebody from rural part of Michigan will be sitting in the class, what is heteroflexible? Then we have to discuss what heteroflexible is. The only rule is you cannot play your own identity. You cannot be a white person playing that identity. That's the only rule. That's right. Then you play the game starts here at the bottom. Then you have INS alert, visa violation, LGBT moves back. There is a welfare loop, corporate ladder, white males can advance fast, racial profiling. So when you reach the picket fence, you reach the game, then the game starts. So it stops there. So you can, when you play the game, when people play the game, whoever reaches, then you can actually check which position you are. There are 33 steps, so you can actually see which position you are. So you can talk about quantitatively, you can collect data. So it can be a pedagogical tool. It can also be an action research tool. So you can actually collect data, tell students how different limiting identities also affect your social mobility. Okay, what is the game? So you roll a dice, then you move, then you take a card from it's basically from more like a Monopoly. Playing the game, so you have the order, then you have a chance card allowed. This is what the chance card. The chance card describes the microaggressions or the experiences experienced by most marginalized community people, right? So for example, you are driving to visit your grandmother and get pulled over by police in an instance of profiling. All black males move back 2 spaces. So whoever is embodying a black identity will move back 2 spaces. So then it may not be the person who rolled the dice, but whoever is in the group. You are complimented how well you speak English. All native English-speaking Asian Americans move back 2 spaces. So basically, it really gives different sense of. So we have about the chance card really describe various experiences people normally don't pay attention to. You return from your spring trip in Paris, the crowd is waiting to pass through customs. You are directed to a separate line for fingerprinting. All non-US citizens move back 2 spaces. So other women comment on how beautiful your hair is and want to touch it. While you are chatting with your coworker in the coffee shop, someone does reach out and touch your hair without warning. All black, Asian, and Native women move back 2 spaces. I didn't realize this is somebody does this all the time. So being an Asian American woman, she's very sensitive to this. The developer of the game, Jennifer. So people actually pay attention to these sort of issues. So once you finish the game, then we have a debriefing where people talk about suppose the game, when people who has reached the picket fence, then the game stops, they ring a bell, then everybody who would have different identities write about where they are. So that you can actually see how the multiple identities simultaneously can affect the mobility. It's a random event, the identity you got, because we randomly give you an identity. Then you all roll a dice, there's also a chance card. So all those things. Then the students write about what happens and they really discuss, I never thought about this question at all. This happens to other persons. Then they have a long discussion, we facilitate discussion so that they not only notice these things, then we are asking them, what will you do if this happens next time when you go for Thanksgiving, all the uncles sitting with you, and somebody says something, how do you respond to these kind of questions? Or how do you respond to help your friend who is going through this? How to talk about from intersectional awareness to coalition building, how to connect with other persons who are different from you. So that's really the goal of this. Then this tool is very useful. We really did some empirical work. We found people who use the board game are more likely to have a very higher awareness of intersectionality. They are higher in perspective taking. They're compassionate, all kind of different measures. We actually do pre and post even, we could do during the time. So it's a very useful tool. It takes between 2 to 3 hours. Widely used now in schools. Almost all social psychology courses in UFM use this board game. Then we also developed an intersectionality tree, sometimes help students to assess. It's an assessment tool, we can use it. So I left copies of this, so you can actually take one. So it's a tree, it also visually helps students to think about another way of thinking about intersectionality. Each of your own identity has own privileges. Rate your awareness of your privileges for each identity on a 1 to 10 scale. In the swings, all the swings are for the privileges and the balloons are for the connection. So you reach out to other people. So people think how they think in different identities, where they are, what kind of privileges they have. So we do it in the beginning of the class, then we do the same assessment at the end of the course. So their privilege awareness increases, their interconnectedness also increases by the end of the term. So it's really another easy tool for you to use. It can be used in a variety of ways. It also helps students write about their own identity they want to talk about. So we look at interconnectedness as well as, then it's also phenomenological. People think about, oh, I hate my ethnic identity, or they talk about this, because the Asian Americans score very low on ethnic identity, how much they love their identity, because we score very low compared to any other ethnic group. So that'll be very, so this is another tool, can be used really to think about intersectionality as a board game is one thing. If you don't have time, this can be used. This can be also used as the assessment tool, beginning at the end of the term. Then my other work where I connect students to really think about is invisibility, especially dirty work. Dirty work is characterized within the organizational psychology. It's a literature where people do the cleaning, sex workers, massage parlor workers. These are the people who are considered dirty work within quote. Butchers, the another group. So they are the most marginalized, most of the communities. For example, in India, most of the sanitation work is done by Dalits. So Dalits do 95% of the cleaning is done by Dalits. So all my work has been with Dalits. So this is the group I want to study. And then I've been thinking about the idea of invisibility, how their suffering is invisible. And that's really, and majority of the Buddhists in India are from this community too. It's a very interesting paradox how Indian things work. Dignity and dirty work. So in this place, I really use the intersectional awareness to really talk about dignity, your own dignity, and the dignity of the other person. How to really engage in a way to develop a dignity culture, the way you imagine your organization, or the context in which you're working. So urban life means your shit is not your problem. This is urban planning people talk about this. Basically, it's invisible. Most of the janitorial work, if you go to New York, it's 95% of the time either Mexicans or an immigrant group who just arrived. They are the one who are doing the cleaning. It's almost universal in all the major cities in the US. So Dirty Pretty Things looks at exactly, if you haven't seen the movie, I highly recommend the film. It's a very beautiful British film. It was nominated for the best international film. It really talks about the janitorial work in the underbelly of London, hotel workers. It happens in a hotel. It's a nice movie. So I studied janitors in 3 countries, US, South Korea, and India. So we focus on how they think about who they are, how people treat them. Each culture has a very different way of organizing. US, we study University of Michigan. We have about 480 janitors, about 2/3 of them participate in our study. It's the most integrated workforce in the US. It's about 50% people of color, 50% white. So it's a very most interesting workforce demographic. South Korea, 95% of the South Korean janitors are women. They are middle-aged women. They didn't have finished high school. Many of them almost all of them are Christians. We converted Christians. And India, 95% of them almost, or other 5% will be Muslims. 95% of them are Dalits who does the cleaning. So we looked at these 3 places. So 3 things we noticed. One is mistreatment of work. Incivility. People don't really pay attention to, sometimes mistreat you. The invisibility is the major issue. People actually talked a lot about how they are treated. Lack of appreciation, not noticed when entering a room. You say good morning and they look right through you. So when I teach my mindfulness leadership class, I also bring it up. So in the middle of the course, I bring dignity to the discussion. All of the students actually pay attention to who is cleaning in our floor. And they pay attention because I also teach in the evening so that students had a chance to meet them, because our janitorial shift is one of the horrendous shifts you can think of. They come at 4 p.m. in the evening. They work at till 12 a.m. Whether you are a single mother, you have to work in their schedule. That's that normal schedule. That means most likely you don't see them. If you are a faculty, less likely to see them unless you work late in your room. When not noticed when entering a room, you say good morning and they look right through you. So people have been studying janitors in academic space. People like Peter Magolia has been studying in Miami University. How universities are becoming corporate spaces, thinking about that. We are looking at neoliberalism and how it affects workplace. This is sort of broader pace. Then we talk about social context of janitorial labor. It's very ubiquitous. It's also dangerous in a sense. The number of chemicals used by janitors are the highest in the US. They have the highest number of chemicals compared to South Koreans and Indians. And they were joking, they can actually make a bomb in the building. They have all the chemicals they need. They don't have to buy anything. They just need only instructions. So they have all the it's so many chemicals. You can't believe when you go to their class set and how much chemical they use. So it's also solitary, and they're very invisible. So nobody notices what I do until I don't do it. So it's very stigmatized. People notice the thing we do for them until we stop, right? So the invisibility is a major part of the problem. So I help students think through the question of invisibility. When you become aware, when you are noticing how to expand it to the everyday interactions, especially with people who are less privileged than you are. So the people's work who are very important to me in thinking through this, as usual, psychologists don't really study dignity. We study self-esteem. Typically, we study self-esteem. Very few people actually looked at dignity. Mostly studied by sociologists. Randy Hudson, who wrote the book Dignity and Labor, he's a labor sociologist. He really looked at mismanagement, overwork, limits on autonomy, contradictions of employee involvement. So how people treat them is important. Dignity in work and dignity at work. So this is Sharon Bolton's work. She really talked about what kind of dignity you have in your work and how the dignity is also, you can get dignity by doing respectful work. So, as I told you before, this is the most integrated workforce. So the dignity, at least I help students think about in three different ways, dimensions. One is the personal dignity, so where you talk about who you are, your own volition, how you maintain yourself, integrity, everything. Intersubjective is how you really look at the other person who has dignity and how to process it when you're also in a culture where you're going to do that. So self-worth acceptance, it has an aesthetic quality. When you are dignified, how people respond to some insults with dignity. So we talk about that. Then there is intersubjectivity, recognition of interconnectedness, and try to help students think about make what is invisible visible. So that's one of the assignments they do in class. So whatever they notice that is invisible, and how to think about how to make it visible. They have to really come up with some ways of thinking about invisibility as part of their exercise. Because the students design, as the final project, they design a mindful organization, an organization that has all the mindfulness principles. As a leader, how you're going to design the organization, they have to come up with a mission statement, a vision statement, and they have to think about the practices in the organization that's going to transform. It may not be the organization they are going to start, but they have to think about it as if they're going to have $1 million to do it. To give an example, I also bring Zingerman's to come to my class. CEO of Zingerman's, Ari, comes to my class, who has written a book, An Anarchist Guide to Business. So he runs Zingerman's, one of the most socially engaged business community. So he actually comes to my class to give a lecture how he runs his business. Zingerman's, the deli in Ann Arbor. Zingerman's it was started by two anarchists, and it's a $400 million business. They have never franchised it. All businesses in Ann Arbor. Below Zingerman's. It's part owned by the employees. So it's an open book. Any employee can go and look at what the business deals are. So they actually see everything. So he trains them. I went and followed him for a couple of months, how he treats. So he comes to my class to give a lecture on how he runs his business. So he gives a model how to think of a mindful organization that is engaging, transformative. And his book is also, he has written books about how his own life. It's very cheap. You can buy it from his website. So I'll be happy to give you a link. He also has a training program on how to be a servant leadership model, how to be a servant leader, where you are the leader of the community, but you also servant of the community. And it was a Greenfield's model, but he really developed into a very nice workable thing. So he really shows being mindful and socially engaged does not mean you're going to lose money. You can be profitable. They are not incompatible. So he also talks about dignity culture, how to really create a culture in his organization. For example, Zingerman's restaurant are known for their service. People go, it's very expensive. They are more expensive than many other restaurants because they really pay you full benefits if you work for 20 hours. And he really talk about the practices, how he train his employees. And dignity is a very important part of the training. So in a way, dignity culture is how to prevent dignity injuries, how people can talk about, how you can actually, he has to actually ask them how they feel for the day. There is an emotion thermometer every morning they talk to the group. So somebody is not doing well, that means other people will pitch in for you. It's a very small things he does. And he has nice readings, nice examples of it. So cultural respect, cultural humility, and dignity in and dignity at work. Cultural humility is the term used in social work a lot. How to help people to look at people who are different from you with the goal of learning something from them, with the goal of being inspired from them. Cultural humility provides the perspective to really think about the other person as something to offer to us. That should be the premises. So I really integrate these things. When I talk about dignity, I provide these examples. So then students talk to me about their mother being a janitor. They never told anybody about this. Her mother always told her, I just work in a hotel. They didn't tell she's doing the cleaning. So it's very interesting how this also opens up some ways for students to think about, especially students come from working class background, do talk a lot about their identity after you open up the space for them. And this and the board game both provide certain ways of thinking about who they are, how they can talk about their identity. So that's really very useful. So I try to model how dignity can be a culture in the classroom, how to really think about it, deep listening, and slowly students actually capture these values. It also reflects in the reflection papers. They talk about these questions in the writing. There is some growth in their thinking. So other pedagogical resources we have, which will be useful to you. One is the Global Feminism Project. This is a project where University of Michigan collected in these countries, Brazil, United States, China, Poland, India, Nicaragua, 10 feminist activists from these countries. Their life histories are documented. There is a documentary, you can look at it. All the interviews are transcribed online. You can actually download these transcripts. So you can actually use this transcript to talk about it. So I really assign students go and read somebody from the other country, how their lives are. It's a life history interviews. It's a documentary, it's free, it's open source. You can actually download these interviews. All transcripts are typed and everything is there. You can use it for teaching. So it also shows people pick some other countries, then realize, oh my goodness, I didn't realize about this. So it really helps them to think about how people from different locations talk about their identity, domestic violence, all kind of issues come up, and their politicians, China, every country has very unique story. It's one of the most inspiring resources we have in Michigan, which is available online. So you have the link there. The other one is the Intergroup Dialogue Program. Some of you might know the Intergroup Dialogue Program, which is also open source. So this program is, we have been teaching this course for more than 25 years, and Patricia Green, who was my chair, who hired me when I came. It's a semester-long course. There's a core dialogue on race, means there will be equal number of whites and blacks will be in the class. The entire semester, they only talk about race. They have to engage. They have to talk about it. So, and it is facilitated by a student, not by a faculty member. And you can actually download the material, IGR material from the website. You go to Intergroup Dialogue Program, University of Michigan. The most interesting thing is 25 years later, they have a longitudinal data now. It's also interesting. It's a very high demand course. They have intergroup dialogue on gender, race, social class, Palestinian versus Jewish, you name it. They have a dialogue program for that. And they have data on this. Students write reflection papers. Then they did a follow-up study, what happens to students after 10 years who took the class. People who took the program, who went through the program, semester-long program, they're more likely to hire people from the other ethnic group in their work. When they start a company, they have more friends from the company, right? It's also not a self-selection bias because it's a very highly competitive class to get into. So students are always on a wait list. So it's very easy for them to do a randomized control trial because the wait list become their own control. So they have really RCT data, randomized control trial data on this. So it's a very fascinating. it's a very useful tool because they really teach students how to listen deeply, deep listening, taking perspectives. So these tools are also available. So whenever you want to engage facilitate a dialogue in your contemplative practice class, you can actually use the tools from here. So So in my own work, I look at, I focus on interconnectedness. That's what my work is. So the intersectional level is how you develop a lot of practices to really center yourself. At the intersectional level, how to really think about your identity in relation to other people. And the ecological level, I also study connection to nature and the environmental issues. So a whole bunch of studies we are just finishing on the idea of interconnectedness and the ecological self, the way how you are connected to the larger sense of the world, and including recycling, all kind of stuff. We looked at it. So these are the, not only we use the text, I also use multimodal different ways of learning. I use photo voice in my class where students can take pictures to answer a question. I also teach them how to write poetry. I bring a poet to do a workshop in the beginning of the class. Then they can answer any question with a poem. They can also think of different ways of thinking about these questions. They can write a poem. I brought a shakuhachi player. He did a 1 week long workshop on how to play shakuhachi, which is a Japanese flute. And Koji Matsunabu is a friend of mine. So he brought 25 shakuhachis. We gave one shakuhachi every student for a week to practice. So we did a workshop. And we realized, we found, and the pre and post test, we found their connection to nature scores went up. They do a lot of work on museum. I send students to museum filmmaking. Students can also take a short film to do a project. They can do that too. I also use poems. So as part of to end the talk, I want to read, one of you read a poem by Kurihara Sadako, who's a very famous poet in Japan. She was 3 miles away from Hiroshima when the bomb was there. So she was an activist, peace activist for a long time. And I left her poems here so people can take the poems too. So I want one of you can read the poem. You want to read? Any one of you volunteer? Got the wrong one. I can also circulate this before. So a famous collection is poem is when we say Hiroshima, but the poem Let Us Be Midwives is the famous one. Anne, you want to read?
Let us be midwives. Night in the basement of concrete structure. Victims of the atomic bomb jammed the room. It was dark, not even a single candle. The smell of fresh blood, the stench of death, the closeness of sweaty people, the moans. From out of all that, lo and behold, a voice, the baby's coming. In that hellish basement, at that very moment, a young woman had gone into labor in the dark without a single match. What to do? People forgot their own pains, worried about her. And then, I'm a midwife, I'll help with the birth. The speaker seriously injured herself, had been lonely only moments before. And so, new life was born in the dark of that day. And so, the midwife died before dawn, still bathed in blood. Let us be midwives, let us be midwives, even if we lay down our own lives to do so.
Thank you. So it also helps students to think about their own suffering in relation to other people, larger context of what suffering is, how to think about the context. Sometimes I use the poem in the beginning of the class. I use a set of poems to anchor. Mary Oliver's poem I use, the other poems, so in the beginning, so that helps them to really think through this. Then towards the end of the course, we actually revisit these poems. And the poems actually shape their writing. I could see how their writing is shaped by these ideas over time. So it's very useful to really help them to discuss these questions. So I'm going to stop here. So if you have any questions, we can have time for it. Thanks for your time.
Thank you for your talk. All of these issues are, I think it goes without saying, of unquestionable importance, and it's great to see how you're bringing them in pedagogically. I keep coming back to this slide in my mind that you had where you were contrasting the Four Noble Truths, conception of suffering in Buddhism, and intersectionality, reframing of those questions to get at social relationships and the kind of key issues that you unpacked later. And I guess I'd like to hear more of your thoughts about how and where mindfulness or other contemplative practices are relevant, because I keep asking myself, like, given the Buddha's very arguably individualistic conception of suffering and the individual responsibility around the alleviation of that suffering, why do we even need to engage that at all to deal with the questions that you're trying to deal with?
Exactly.
And I think this is part of the critique of the people like Ron Purser and other people in the critical mindfulness world too, who are arguing that maybe reframing the suffering around individual responsibility is even counterproductive, given that it takes attention away from all of the social and embedded and structural issues. So I'd just like to hear more about where some conception of contemplative practice comes in for you.
I think it's really good, because in fact I use your paper on mindfulness, critiquing this as a assigned reading, so they really get a counterpoint to this. So they actually get your views in my class. So I actually use it as a simple exercise to really think about, I help them. So it's not a very deep, in a way, philosophically engaging with it. I make sure that I assign your work so they actually, they also learn your critique. So it's really, what I noticed, it's a very specific pedagogical context I'm doing this work, right? So I have students who will, as a Michigan, I was surprised to realize how privileged my students are as a state school. The average family income is $120,000. And a third of my students come from $300,000 and above household income. So I have to really think about, say for them, not finding a parking space, they will have a heart attack. So that's really the kind of suffering they're in. So they really provide them a little bit of context. So that's really, so it's a very micro level, the particular context I'm doing. So I want to make sure that I bring your work to really see, this is what scholars really are arguing. Do we need this question? So make sure you actually have that perspective too. Ron Purser and all this work, I really bring that. But at the same time, the suffering is also situational in a way, a lot of suffering around different marginalized identities. It really opens up some ways of thinking about narratives. It's a pedagogical intervention in a sense. For me, it's very local. I think it is very local in a way. It really opens up for students who are marginalized in the class to open up. I have an African-American student, after this slide, talks about his brother who came out of prison, called him yesterday, how he has to deal with that question of suffering and compassion. So it's very local that way. I agree with you. Whether we need this question is a very important question. You are very articulate about how we talked about that in the mindfulness paper too. So, so I help students to really think about this question so that really push them. Same, the Harikara, the poem also really pushes them to think about, have a perspective, that's all. It's very, very local intervention, pedagogical intervention, where I want them to really think beyond their lives, beyond their cell phones, beyond their computers, to really think slightly. So don't really see this abstractly, so just to try to provide a context. Right? Even this slide was really, I was debating this slide. It was developed by a Latina queer who was my grad student. We had a long discussion about it. I said, I'm going to, this paper we discussed it, yes, but we should at least provide some very basic tools. So it's really very basic intervention. I counterpoint with your paper and make sure they know that.
Ram, thank you so much for such a rich presentation. It feels like each slide is a portal into a whole body of literature and work that you and others have done, and so I appreciate it. I really appreciated that when you talked about mindfulness, you used Thich Nhat Hanh, because Thay's work is so much more intersectional in its
Correct.
view, and so much more based on interdependence and a real broad understanding of what mindfulness means. And too few people draw on his work as basic for a kind of view. When we stay with the kind of American secular manifestations like MBSR, we miss, there's a whole cultural filter that really limits our ability to understand the intersectional view of a lot of those teachings. And so I appreciate that as a way to sort of go deeply into an already embedded intersectional, interdependent view that is very much there in his work. And when we were talking yesterday about various mindfulnesses, I think about how important it is to return to the kind of view that he has brought to interpretation of those teachings. So just wanted to thank you for using Thay's work in this way.
I think Willoughby was very good yesterday saying this MBSR is a jam session, right? He jammed and he created it. I said, this is my jam session. This is what I tell my students. This is how people come up with. And, empirically or sometimes pedagogically it works. It may not be work in other contexts.
Yes.
And I also push them to think about phenomenologically, experientially. This is how it feels for you to work. So that's really important for me to, as a teacher, such a quantitatively driven program. My program is really almost, I'm the only person who does qualitative research. That also I could do it only after I got my tenure. So it's really very difficult to help my students and my colleagues to think how to bring this up. So the phenomenologically students can engage.
I think the other part is some of the work that I've done with my Naropa colleagues is beginning to understand how the mindfulness movement is embedded in such white privilege and individualism that it misses a lot of the traditional context. So any way we can begin to draw on other sources than, for example, MBSR, it's better for really seeing the kind of radical interbeing quality of those teachings.
And Bell Hooks is very helpful, extremely helpful, articulated about this.